Hello everyone, can you hear me? Judging by the nods, I'll take that as a yes. So welcome to Barings. My name is Sean, I'm the Stewardship Director here. So I work with our different investment teams on implementing best practice on stewardship. It's a personal pleasure to be introducing this session today. I worked at the PRI for 4 years. Great to be representing Barings, and thanks for all the experience at PRI to put me here. I think from a stewardship perspective, it's great to see the PRI doing this. I think ultimately to have the common language between asset owners, investment managers and companies on these complex issues heading towards a just transition is exactly what we need. So yeah, I wish this grant all the best. So Katherine, I'll hand over to you to give us an overview of the grant itself. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Hi, I'm Katherine, Head of Research at the PRI, and welcome to this launch event for the Reynolds Gifford PRI Grant. A tall Norwegian told me when I asked him, what does it take to be the CEO, the leader of the PRI? And Martin Skanker said that selecting the CEO is the single most important thing any board does. CEOs are key to turning strategy into tangible outcomes, and that James and Fiona were excellent leaders for the PRI who came in with skills matching the different challenges the organisation was facing at different points in its history. I also asked around for interesting stories about them, but they were too interesting for the recording. But there was a common thread that ran through both what colleagues past and present said, and that was with James and Fiona, their door was always open. If you had an idea, maybe what seemed like a crazy idea at the time, if you wanted to talk or had solutions, through their actions, they challenged you to think bigger, to do better, and to dare. Let's take this moment to thank Fiona and James. Thank you. The Reynolds Gifford PRI Grant is a new agenda-setting initiative. The PRI's research programme seeks to bridge the gap between academics and investors, so that academics are aware of investors' needs and investors can engage with evidence and insights from RI academic research. We can learn from each other. The topic of this grant is one that needs attention and urgency. The call for research we're launching today asks for research proposals on the ways in which responsible investment currently does or does not contribute to a sustainable and equitable global financial system, and the potential paths forward to improve its contributions. We're interested in research that answers the following key questions. How can investors and responsible investment better understand and address the different contexts of global North and global South markets to create a sustainable financial system that benefits the environment and society as a whole? What roles can responsible investment play in addressing systemic challenges, including inequality, entrenched poverty, and a just transition to a low-carbon economy? And how can the roles and utility of responsible investment in the context of global North, global South challenges and power imbalances be understood to better address systemic challenges? The PRI will be awarding £300,000 over 5 years for this initiative, and this will be for bringing together researchers from the global North and South to learn and engage with each other and with practitioners, such as through event series and workshops. For new applied research that informs investment practitioners and practice, and for PhD fellowships to support students from low-income countries and/or from underrepresented groups with their studies. We would like expressions of interest to this call by the 28th of June. Those shortlisted will be interviewed by the jury about what they're proposing and then selecting the awardee for this opportunity. We're looking for an interdisciplinary team based in the global South and North with an innovative proposal of international relevance with societal impacts. But what can you expect right here and right now? As you can see, we have James Gifford on Additionality, a 20-year search for the secret sauce in impactful investing. Fiona Reynolds, speaking about where has responsible investment failed and where to next. Then David Wood discussing what is responsible investment good for, potential research ideas. Then we have a panel discussion, a Q&A with you, and PRI's CEO David Atkin closing the remarks before a drinks reception. Before I hand over to James, a few brief notices. So please put your phones on silent and to keep an eye out for the post-event email in which we ask you for your feedback about this event, and it will also have links to the recording as well as how to apply. As someone who has developed PRI's academic research activities over the last 10 years, we have over 12,000 members from around the world in our academic network. Find out more about what we provide on our webpage, other opportunities like our call for papers, interactive seminars on new research and horizon topics for investors, monthly blogs, accessing PRI data for research and other tools. Here are the links for joining the academic network, and the one on the left is where you'll find how to apply for this grant, and an ask for your feedback about your RI interests and expertise so our community can connect better. Now, it just leaves me to say thank you to the speakers and each of you. Be prepared to be open, inspired, and to the academics here or watching on catch up, I look forward to your application by the end of June to academic@unpri.org. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Katherine, and I'm so delighted and honoured to be here to launch this award that's named after my successor Fiona and myself. It truly is an honour, and when Katherine emailed and said this was the idea of the PRI board, it was really an incredible sense of satisfaction and honour. I want to talk today, the topic of my talk is a 20-year search for additionality. Now, additionality is the attribute of something that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Are you adding to the pot of impact or good to the world? So back in 2002, I did a master's thesis in Sydney where I compared negative screening, best in class on the one hand, with shareholder engagement and activism on the other hand. And I came to the conclusion that actually if you want to have an impact in investment, then shareholder engagement or active ownership or activism, as it was kind of mostly called at the time, was overwhelmingly more impactful than simply not owning something. And so I then enrolled in a PhD to work out how to make engagement as effective as possible and had 4 months spare. So I went to the UN as an intern at the end of 2003. And just that year or the year before, the IFC had launched the Equator Principles. And so we were thinking of what to launch at this big event in mid-2004 with Kofi Annan. And the way the UN works is that everything's based around what you can launch at the next big opportunity. And so I came up with this idea, why don't we use the UN platform to develop a set of principles, kind of off the Equator Principles were for project finance in developing countries, but there were no principles for pension funds and institutional investors. So I thought, well, why don't we create a set of principles backed by the UN, based around shareholder engagement and targeting the world's pension funds. And the first working title was the Global Principles for Pension Fund Engagement. And I pitched this idea to my boss, Paul Clements Hunt at UNEP FI, and he said, oh, that sounds like a good idea. How much do I have to pay you to keep working on that? And so he matched my PhD scholarship, and that became the project. And then shortly after, we merged in the materiality kind of ESG integration concept, which had come from a bunch of asset managers, the Asset Management Working Group at UNEP FI. And they sort of merged, and that became Principle 1, ESG integration, and Principle 2, active ownership. And those two sort of got taken forward. And in terms of additionality, it was always the active ownership piece, which I saw as the additionality element of the PRI. Now, of course, ESG integration creates a huge demand for research, and that research alone actually is impactful in terms of transparency in the economy and so on. But I always felt it was the direct use of shareholder influence to push companies to improve that was the most additional element of the PRI. And so we went forward. It was the first thing we scaled up was the Shareholder Collaboration Forum. We had 4 people working on that and only 2 people working on everything else. And then that continued and we went right through till 2013 to become the largest initiative in sustainable investing in the world. Now, I then thought, well, the ESG movement already has great momentum. So maybe it's time for me anyway to think, can I be more additional elsewhere? So I went to Harvard and set up a course with David Wood on impact investing for the inheritors from the world's wealthiest families and continue to teach that course. And we're on our 10th year this year. But I want to reflect on the PRI and the PRI's additionality kind of going forward. Now, while I still think there's an important role for shareholder engagement, I do sometimes wonder whether we've picked a lot of the low-hanging fruit. So in my PhD thesis, I concluded that the most effective type of engagement is where the investor actually brings added knowledge to the company. Of course, there's a role for putting pressure on and jumping up and down in the media, and companies do respond to that to a degree. But actually, if you want the most sustained change, then you convince somebody genuinely that it's in their best interest to do something and they believe you, and then they do it. And then, of course, you're going to get that change. But what happens if that company already has 100 professionals who work day in, day night internally to find exactly those win-wins? Well, it makes it a lot more difficult for shareholders to come in and add value or tell the company something they don't already know. And that's why for certainly large cap companies in North America and Europe, I wonder whether investors can actually tell companies something they don't already know. Now, that means that there's probably still good opportunities in small cap, emerging markets, where there's a lot less knowledge on sustainability. So I think there is a really important role for engagement. However, I think going forward, we need to think, how can the PRI and its signatories look and search for the next type of additionality? And in my view, that has to come from 2 ends of the barbell. And the first one is early stage technology. If we are going to solve the world's problems, including climate and health and all sorts of things, increasing rapidly the technological progress is really absolutely essential. And the second end of the barbell, or the other end of the barbell, is frontier markets. We have to pull 1 billion people out of poverty. Now, these are not disconnected. And I want to give you an example of Ethiopia. So I have 5 Ethiopian nieces. My sister adopted 5 young girls, all from the same biological family, and now they're all adults in Australia. So I have a kind of a little bit of an affinity for Ethiopia. Ethiopia's electricity consumption per capita is 1% that of Switzerland. 1%. Its GDP per capita is less than $1,000 US. Switzerland's 90,000. I'm not quite sure what the UK is. It's probably roughly in the same ballpark, between 1% and 2%. Imagine if 98, 99% of all electricity in the whole of the UK was gone. That is the amount of electricity that Ethiopians are actually using today. And their population is expected to double by the end of the century. Now, just to get Ethiopia where Switzerland is today, they're going to need around about a 200x increase in electricity consumption. And maybe they don't want to be just where Switzerland is today. Maybe in 70 years, they might like to be with AI and all kinds of other use cases for electricity. Maybe they want to actually be way beyond where Switzerland is today. So we're talking hundreds of fold increase in electricity need. and they simply cannot afford to pay a massive premium for that electricity. So we have a few options. Either the richest countries in the world massively subsidise, and we've seen how that can go in terms of populism and so on, or we invent our way out of it. And I think this is absolutely what we need to do. We need to get huge amounts of capital into early stage technologies. As soon as we get batteries 95% cheaper than they are today, suddenly all renewables become baseload, and we actually can fully compete against the cheapest fossil fuels in the most developing countries, for example. And whether it's healthcare, whether it's all kinds of other technologies. So that is really interconnected. But early stage technologies are highly risky. And large pension funds basically don't do early stage venture, let alone seed stage venture. And they certainly don't do much, if any, frontier market investment at all. So my challenge to the researchers in this grant, and I think everything I said, it would basically fit somewhere in those points that Katherine has outlined. The challenge for this grant is to work out how large investors can channel capital into early stage tech and frontier markets. And frontier markets, not just renewable energy. I mean frontier markets, anything to pull people out of poverty in a responsible, dignified way. Because unless we can pull people out of poverty, 1 billion people, we will not achieve our environmental goals. We will not achieve our social justice goals. Whatever our goals are, we have to get people out of poverty, and we have to get those technologies dramatically cheaper than they are today. So that is my challenge to the researchers, and in implication, that is also my challenge to the PRI. Can we actually find ways, whether it's blended finance, whether it's partnering with the World Bank, whatever it is, can we find ways, aggregating up for early stage VC funds, what is it that could get large pension funds investing in those two ends of the barbells, early stage technology and frontier markets for poverty alleviation? Thank you.
Well, thank you. James and I are incredibly aligned on our thinking, and so that helped form the thinking of what we wanted from the scholarship. But thanks everyone for joining us today. I want to thank Sean for hosting us, and Barings for hosting us as well. I really love seeing PRI alumni go on to do great things in responsible investment in other organisations. It's also very heartwarming to see a number of familiar faces in the audience, and thank you for coming along. I've got to say that, like James, I was deeply honoured when I was told about the scholarship and then could discuss with James about where we wanted it to head. So I really want to thank the PRI for providing us with this scholarship. Thanks to Katherine and the academic network team, but thank you to David as well. And I also wanted to particularly thank Martin Skunker, who used to be the chair of the PRI, who really was the champion behind this. And I miss working with Martin every day. Building on what James had to say, and it's always hard to follow James, I really like to delve into what I see as some of the pressing issues, and really about the limitations of the current responsible investment practices. Get to the Q&A and we have a bit of a panel discussion. Together we can try and come up with some solutions to take things forward. In making these comments though, I do want to say that that doesn't mean, just because I said where responsible investments failed, does not mean that I don't think that responsible investment hasn't come a really long way. And it doesn't mean that I don't think the PRI has really been instrumental in steering us away from sort of the reckless greed is good ideas of the past. So whilst I believe that we need a bit of a revolution in responsible investment, I don't believe we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I really believe that Principles 1 and Principles 2 remain as important today as when they were launched back in 2006. Improving companies, the way they operate, their diversity, how they integrate ESG risks and opportunities into their operations, how they integrate the transition to a low carbon economy, how businesses adapt to climate change is important, and it's going to continue to be important. And it does have an impact. It's just that impact to me is limited. It's not unimportant, it's just that it's limited. And I think that we should accept that. Perhaps also it's just unrealistic to expect the private sector to be the ones who have to resolve all of the world's major problems. But I also think that the private sector's role is undeniably crucial, and we should also accept that. Now, we spend a lot of time in the responsible investment space talking about real-world impact. So let's take a little bit of stock about real-world impact, where we are through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals. So as we know, these 17 goals, to me, they're not just aspirations, but they're also an investment opportunity, and one that numerous investors, many corporates have pledged to uphold and to integrate into their operations. And I think the SDGs try to challenge us to reimagine and reshape our world, emphasising sustainability, equality, peace and justice. But if we take stock through the lens of the SDGs, we're really compelled to confront a very hard truth. If these goals are our measure of real-world impact, then frankly, we have not really succeeded where we had hoped that we would. As they currently stand, only 15% of the SDGs' underlying targets are on track. 15%. Many of them have gone backwards, and that's because of a lack of action. And while individual targets will be met, like individual targets in certain countries will be met, and that's not unimportant either, it's highly unlikely that we will achieve overall one of the 17 SDGs. So, as the UN Secretary-General said, the SDGs are more than just a set of objectives. They represent the hopes, they represent the dreams and the rights and the expectations of people globally. And it's now 2024, so in terms of that 30-year agenda, that the 2030, the 15-year agenda, we're just over the halfway point. We're at the halfway point in time, but we are nowhere near the halfway point in action. COP28 has wrapped up in Dubai. Plans are busily underway for COP29 in Baku. Climate, which is arguably the most important SDG and the one that receives the most attention from governments, from the private sector, is not on track. Keeping the world to 1.5 degrees of warming seems highly unlikely, if not impossible. There's always hope, but with James's tech revolution, maybe there's some hope. At best, even with a lot more action, we've probably reached somewhere around 1.7 to 1.8 degrees of warming. We know that the natural world is at a tipping point, inequality is growing, and conflict around the world is on the rise. When it comes to climate change and inequality, we also need to not just focus on the energy transition, but on adaptation and mitigation strategies, especially for the developing world. We must be really beginning to plan to manage the repercussions of surpassing the 1.5 degree threshold. And I think that governments around the world really need to be honest with people and openly discuss the realities of climate change, including the implications for the economic costs, but also for stability, for immigration, for refugee policies, and a whole lot more. I don't think that they're really honest about the big picture. And if we don't confront these realities, we're going to see more conflict across the world. We're going to see more climate migration and more climate refugees. And we know what happens in many countries when we start to see too many refugees. And of course, this is going to happen due to water scarcity, crop failures, food insecurity, and the impacts of extreme weather events. And eventually, we're going to see more parts of the world that just aren't inhabitable anymore. So there really is a dire need to direct more capital to emerging, frontier, and fragile economies. And the investment should not just be sustainable, but it also needs to be equitable. And we really have to find a way of breaking this current cycle where money is just not going to where it needs to go. And this is where I do think that we need to see some kind of evolution, I think maybe a revolution, in responsible investment if we truly want to have an impact in the real world. I think to address these challenges, as Jane said, we need to really explore more innovative financing methods, whether that's through increased impact investing, blended finance, but focusing really on holistic outcomes. Although I would hope that we could be a little bit more ambitious than that. We need to get that capital flowing from the developed world to the emerging economies. And we need to get investment to where it's needed, and we just aren't. Inequality and poverty is a major source of conflict across the world, and conflict is a major source of food insecurity and the displacement of people. And everything is interconnected, as you were saying, James. Everything that we do is interconnected, and one problem that we don't solve causes other problems. And we really need to understand that, and we need to act accordingly. If I come back to the SDGs, as I said, they represent an investment agenda. So they do provide an opportunity to invest in the developing world, invest in the physical infrastructure, renewable energy, electrification, broadband, transportation, health, education, all of those things that developing countries really need. Yet sadly, low-income countries face major fiscal constraints that represent really significant barriers to investment. When it comes to the SDGs, developing countries need $4 trillion annually to meet the SDGs. And this is up from 2.5 trillion when they were launched in 2015. And that gap is because of lack of action. The longer you leave it, the more it's going to take to solve the problem. Global foreign direct investment has fallen by 12%. Developing countries pay up to 7 times more than developed countries to access international capital markets. While we've seen an allocation to renewables has really tripled, the lion's share is going to developed countries. That, of course, needs to happen, but climate change isn't going to stop if we don't help developing countries make the transition as well. I also think in the responsible investment world, we've done a lot of talking about a just transition. But in many ways, a lot of that work which I've been involved in, and it's been extremely important, really is just about a just transition for those people who live in the developed world and how they're going to transition. So we really need to be thinking about how we make sure that those in developing countries have a just transition as well. And that can't happen without investment and without money. And of course, many investors, as we know, shy away from investing in the developing world due to increased risks. In some cases, not all cases, those risks are really real. So you understand why they are staying away from those countries. Yet 75% of the world's most impoverished people and those in dire need of SDG-driven interventions reside in fragile and conflict-dependent regions, and it encompasses more than 1.9 billion people in the world. So there really exists a pressing demand from both the private sector and governments for investing and funding, yet as I said, only a fraction of the requisite capital finds its way to these critical needs. So we need to step up, and the private sector really needs to play a role. I do think that as an industry, as investors, as corporations, we need to think more holistically about risk, impact and outcomes. We live in an interconnected world. There is no way to get around that. And climate change doesn't understand borders. It doesn't stop just because we meet a few EU targets and they've put together some nice sustainable investment projects. That's good, needed, but it's not going to stop climate change. And it's not going to do all the things that we need. And development requires investment, but really investment is not possible without peace and stability. But if we could see only 1% of annual global issuance in sustainable investment was aligned with reducing conflict and inequality and creating peace in the world, that would equal more than 16 trillion in SDG aligned finance going into the developing world. So new solutions to finance development in the world's fragile and conflict areas is needed. One of the things that I do now is chair an organisation called Finance for Peace, which hopefully I can talk a little bit more about later in the panel. That's all about how do we get investment into the developing world. Hamish is also here and I'm on his advisory board. He used to work at the PRI as well, and he's got a whole lot of investors who are also working on the whole issue around migration and refugees and what the investors are doing. Peter's here and he's doing a whole lot of work on this as well. So it's not that there isn't work happening, but it's little pockets happening, and we really need to have it at scale. So I think we won't, as I said, we won't solve climate change and the risks they pose to investors without addressing in the funding gap for the developed world. And we also won't meet the aims of the SDGs. And I think we must acknowledge that. We probably need to accept it. I hope we don't. I hope we say that we want to be part of the solution to fund the SDGs. We can't just keep saying we want to measure impact and have an impact in the real world if what we really mean is that the real world stops at the borders of Western Europe, the United States and other developed countries. And if that is what we mean, then I think we should be clear, and we should not give false hope that there is all this capital out there that is available for investment when we aren't prepared to deploy it. At the end of the day, I think there's only really two things that matter, and that's people and the planet, including everything, all the species, etc., that inhabit the world. And the journey ahead in responsible investment is really clear to me. It might be challenging and it might be difficult, but investment is crucial for a just and peaceful world. And we need to ensure that our impact transcends borders and truly benefits global communities. So by investing in solutions that address fundamental needs like food, housing, education, protecting the natural world, I think that's where we can really try to bridge a gap and fulfil the promise of the SDGs. But we really need to work together towards a future where responsible investment truly translate into truly global progress. And I really hope, as James does, that this scholarship can play a role in thinking about how we do bridge that gap. I know everything that I'm saying isn't easy. If it was easy, we would have already solved the problem now. But we can't just keep turning our back. We need to actually really focus on these issues. So like I said, I hope that the scholarship program can play a role in advancing this thinking, and I really look forward to when we start getting some of the proposals back and we're able to award some of the money in the scholarship to people. So thank you, and a thank you again to the PRI.
You think they're honored to be here. I've never been CEO of PRI. I'm not Australian. And I'm a fake academic. I mean, it's really unlikely that I'd be the third following up. I'm delighted to be here. My name is David Wood. I work at the Kennedy School, and I've been studying responsible investment, the Kennedy School at Harvard in the United States. And I've been studying responsible investment for about 20 years. And I took my task today, actually I was given my task today by Katherine, just to talk about some sort of research agendas that I think would be useful and that are in line, I think, with the challenges that James and Fiona just posed for us. And then hopefully we can have a discussion about what kind of research you all think are going to push the field forward to try to meet our global challenges. Before I do that, I should say, maybe explain a little bit why I'm here. I met James. I won't tell stories, but I met James when he was staying in a flop house in Boston. And I still have a career in this field because PRI, in its formation, needed a East Coast location for the final meeting, the third and final meeting of the signatories. That wasn't New York for political reasons. And we happened to be working at Boston College at the time. James came up to host this meeting, living on his per diem from UNEP FI and hosting the world's biggest investors the next day. It was a master class in organizing. And I cannot tell you how much I learned about the culture of institutional investment and how much that's shaped the way I think about the field. That meeting was amazing. James came to us when he left PRI in 2013 with the promise that he'd be a fellow for a year at the Initiative for Responsible Investment, where I worked, and write a book on the history of responsible investment, and he did not do this. He failed to do this. Nevertheless, we still love him. I got to know Fiona on project work with PRI, and in particular project work on economic inequality and just transition, my two favorite topics. For the field, not least because they're very challenging for the field, even threatening. And I really appreciated the way that Fiona asked investors to take on issues in which they were implicated, for which they had a burden, but it was really hard to make the business case naturally or easily. And I think that was, for me, like the way forward for research. Fiona also gave me my first chance to talk about the history of responsible investment formally, which is the topic on which I'm engaged now. You should know that because I'm going to say you need more historians in the field in a second. And I'm married to an anthropologist. You should know that because I think I'm going to call for a lot more anthropology too. I will try not to drone on about the 70s. But if you want to talk about the 70s at the drink session, hit me up. That's what I'm into right now. Really great to be here. So I'm going to say a couple words about what I think the current state, or at least the recent past of research has been, and then a couple things about where I think we should go with research in the field. I'm associating myself, in it, even though I'm not really quite of it. I'll leave it at that. When I started in the field, I was brought into this field by Steve Leidenberg, who was the L in KLD Research and Analytics. It was called Socially Responsible Investment then. This was in the early 2000s. And a lot had happened in the 90s to create the institutional framework for where we are now. The institutional building blocks of money management, of corporate research, of shareholder engagement were in place. But the field really hadn't taken off. That was the organizing project of PRI that really changed the circumstances for the field, I think. By the way, I can't resist. I also think that's why the field doesn't have a very good sense of its own history. Everyone who comes to it thinks it's new. And so many people have come into it, even in the last 5 years, that they don't know what happened in the past. Now the research, academic research lagged practice. As it typically does. But there was also this thing about socially responsible investment becoming responsible investment. The focus was on mainstreaming. And I think practitioners, the PRI, focused on proving that this field was an acceptable form of finance, and academic research followed that kind of mission for the organizers. So most of the research was about how does responsible investment make sense within the conventions of finance. That meant a lot of return studies based on KLD data, because KLD data was given to, very brilliantly by KLD, given to academics early. And the question was, are you going to lose any money if you do this? And the answer kind of became no. Can you make any money if you do this? Maybe, but that's what they all say. Return studies were really paradigmatic. That was what, if you went to the first PRI academic network conferences, which I was lucky enough to go to, they were the sort of core. And then you would have some things on the outside. Then you had some theory building. I mean, the theory of the universal investor, popularized by Jim Hawley and Andy Williams, really, I think, became the calling card of the early PRI, sort of the theoretical basis on which responsible investment was played. But really, that was a way to say, look, if you think properly in terms of time horizons, in terms of scale, this makes sense in terms of the conventions of finance. Similar with legal studies. Here, it was a little weird. I think academic study was really driven by the Freshfields report that PRI put out. But you got a lot of legal scholars saying, this fits within your fiduciary duty, and here's why. And we don't have to change fiduciary duty. We just need to understand how this fits. All that makes sense? Yeah? I don't want to say that's everything, especially because Jean-Pascal and Stephanie, Jean-Pascal Gong, Stephanie Giamcaro are here today, and they did lots of really cool research that I would always bump into and think, this is where we should go. Stuff on the politics of calculation. I mean, that's my kind of stuff. And there were studies, one of the first PRI events I went to was in Geis in Switzerland. It was absolutely paradise. We were up there in the Alps. It was snowing. And there were a bunch of people from around the world and from different disciplines. It felt like an area studies meeting, not like a finance meeting, but it was focused on responsible investment. That happened. Most of it was at the margins. Tessa Hebb's work on how pension funds create change, super formational for me. I mean, just brilliant stuff. Didn't quite fit into the paradigm, though, of how do we sort of think of responsible investment within the conventions of finance. How do we act as if responsible investment is a grown-up and shouldn't be at the kids' table anymore, like socially responsible investors were in the 90s? Well, you know, I don't think this is at all surprising. I think functionally there was a real reason for it, and it makes sense in historical context. You know, when PRI was formed, this was a moment, especially in the global north, where the political culture of elites, thought about finance as the answer to problems, and also thought about finance as the engine which drove economic activity. There's a fantastic article by the legal scholar Elizabeth Pullman on the history of ESG that I'm 2 years in and I'm still complaining that I didn't write it. It's like so much better than I would have done, but I'm like, God, I can't believe I got scooped by someone better than me. But she places the history of the term ESG in the context of Kofi Annan's sort of effort to backfill social issues into globalization. Like, if governments can't get control of this roaring economy and roaring finance, how else can we think about the social utility and improving it of what's going on? Weirdly, these assumptions about the utility of finance survived the global financial crisis. There's this wild pivot in the research on responsible investment that happens with responsible investment too, where the return studies were formed within the context of the 2000s and roaring finance. Finance blew up, and responsible investment became the answer from within finance to the crisis. And so not much changed. You got a lot of, maybe in 2000, I was talking with David about San Francisco in 2010, PRI in person. That was a heavy meeting. People were definitely thinking, wow, maybe this system's gone. But quickly it sort of got put back together, I think, and that was true in the academic research too. I'm going on about this because I think the research should shift, or at least there's a moment now we have where research can shift, and I hope that this scholarship can play a part in that. Can I say my 3 things, Katherine? Have I gone on? Okay. I'm just going to say 3 things, but they're kind of long. I should note that these notes were written because I thought we were going to give this from a chair, and that was meant to be all casual. Then we're going to do it behind a podium, which is much more fun. I would have written different notes if I didn't know we were behind a podium. But I get very nervous in front of people, and I can grab the podium firmly, and it's very comforting. So I'm glad we're doing it this way. All right, what's different now? Well, the success of mainstreaming is apparent, right? Even in the United States, the backlash against ESG is an obvious signal that the mainstream, everybody's at the grown-up table now. This is a serious conversation. It kind of worked. The organizing agenda, but also the research agenda around responsible investment made sense. But it's also led to a bit of a crisis of reflection. You see this in the PRI blueprint with thinking about the real-world impacts of investment. You hear it in James and Fiona talking about our major challenges. And that, to me, sort of points to a different way or a different sort of set of topics that research can address for responsible investment. Some of this is theory building. does responsible investment do in the world? We have a lot of new critical finance attacking ESG, or from the left, as well as the kind of attacks from the right politically. What would a positive theory of responsible investment as a challenge to financial conventions, or as a transformation of fight, as a revolution, what would that look like? I think that's part of a research agenda. You see this in work on systemic or systems level investment theorizing. You see it when investors are put in the context of the SDGs or in other sort of major shared global goals. I want to know how responsible investment is embedded in society and how it works with different kinds of social actors, especially because a lot of that work that happened in the 2000s and 2010s has now led to a policy agenda. There's real policy being made on the back of all those voluntary consortia. The reintroduction of industrial policy into discussions about how to challenge, how to tackle great social challenges raises questions for me for how finance is embedded in society, and it raises questions, importantly, for I think responsible investment has a lot to say about how to inform industrial policy, about how it might be the object of industrial policy, but also what a world in which finance is, sort of being put into planning looks like. I hope we can do that in this scholarship, not just in the global north, but in the global south. Not just about what we're going to do about coal in the United States and Germany and Australia, but how we're going to think about systemic transformations across power differentials. That's one. Big picture theory building. Two, and this follows directly on both James and Fiona, I think we need more research on the effects of investors' actions. We see a lot of metrics about social impact. I think that's important. We need to think about what the narrowly construed effects of investor action are, but we need to push that agenda pretty far. And the only caveat, I won't go on because I think you all said it quite well. The only caveat I would add is I think there's a limit to what additionality can tell us about how investors have impact. The paradigmatic case for the growth of the field in the US was shareholder divestment from South Africa. The effects of that divestment would not be captured in any additionality study. What they really did in the US was open the door for a couple senators to change their votes and change the kind of international political context for apartheid in the United States. I think these studies of the impacts of what investors do are especially important considering the global north and global south divide, and especially we're thinking about how capital flows are used to organize inter-country relations can cause harm as well as can produce good. I think there's a lot of danger in the mobilized capital discussion, and responsible investment should be a place, our research should be a place to think about when it helps and when it doesn't. Finally, to go back to what I said at the beginning, we need more disciplines involved, not just historians and anthropologists, though I think cultural studies of how finance acts, we need many more. I'm going to a conference next month in Bologna where a bunch of anthropologists are going to hang out and talk about research into ESG and impact investing. I'm very excited. Critical finance is out there. There's some stuff happening. We need sociologists, we need political scientists, we need legal scholars in addition to business and finance types. But just as importantly, I think we need to reproduce and push that first feeling I had in Geis around area studies, where there's real attention to the global differences and global power imbalances and ways that academics from the global north and global south can interact and drive research agendas, so that we don't end up looking at what responsible investment can bring to the world, but we can have a robust discussion about how responsible investment can be useful in the context of the major social challenges we're facing. We're not going to be able to do all this with a 5-year grant, but it's pretty exciting that it exists, and at least we can think about it and use it to get started. And I'm especially pleased to do it in honor of James and Fiona, who I think are terrific.
Thanks very much. Now, I don't know about you, but I enjoyed that, and thanks for making me look like I'm doing a good job as a moderator by keeping roughly to time.
Roughly.
Yes. My first question will be getting the sense from the academics in the room of what are you looking for? David, you touched on this with the three areas, so I'll turn first to Fiona. What would you love to receive from academics?
Oh, so many things. What I would like them to really focus on, I think I already really talked about, but I would like to see some proposals about how we could, as I said, I think that we've got to break this current cycle where money isn't flowing to where it's needed. So I'd really like to see some good academic research on what the problems are and then what the potential solutions are. And I don't think that means that we don't know what some of the problems are. But when I think back to the early days of the PRI, it was really, really important to keep getting the academic evidence done. Even though the academic evidence told us what we already knew, we had to have something to go out and prove to people that, you know, you weren't going to lose returns, or people wouldn't necessarily listen to us, but if they could see that there was a great paper done by some fantastic academic, then they would read that. It would make a difference. So I still think that academic work has got a really important role to play to help us really drive responsible investment forward. So that's what I would like to see. Well, I'd like to see many things. I'd also like to see some fantastic people in the Global South be able to get some help with their PhDs, of course, and I hope that there's a number of people doing PhDs or wanting to do PhDs who will apply. Those who might, you know, otherwise struggle, that I hope to see that as well.
Thank you. James, what do you think?
I mean, I guess the first thing is that it should be readable. I think academics have real trouble producing things, and David's going to really hate this, but can someone do like the Steve Levitt Freakonomics version of some research that is actually really practical and gives us some experimental tools or something that actually shows what works? And for example, just to be really practical, shareholder engagement in terms of supply chains, what difference does it make? Is there any evidence that companies who change some policy actually has any change on the ground? Are there interventions, for example, that you could combine with organizations like JPAL, which did all of these, you know, randomized controlled trials on deworming or iron supplements in garment factories in Asia or whatever? Could we use shareholder engagement as a tool to combine with evidence-based development interventions in supply chains? I don't know, but these are the kinds of things I'd love to see come out of this type of thing.
And a chance for you to respond, David, maybe not with how much you hate it, but...
But I really hated it. No, so yeah, sure. I mean, I think that we need an evidence base, and we absolutely, I don't mean to say that the research that's gone before needs to go away. We absolutely need research which sort of suggests the financial elements, but you know, we'll take industrial policy. I want research into where investors fit into planning around major government outlays and government regulatory systems that are being developed right now, beyond tax credits to get investors involved. Like, what are the kinds of research agendas that take into account the political relations between investors and labor and corporations and the state? I think that's part of this discussion. It doesn't obviate the need for figuring out what works. But I think if we have too narrow an agenda on what works, I mean, the critique of the randomized control trial, you know, supremacy is that it assumes that the world is as given and won't change. And I think the world has to change a lot. So I think I want a research agenda that takes that into account.
And you both talked a lot about financial and finance vehicles. Have you seen examples of what works and what you'd like to see more of?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure. I think when it comes to, you know, developing markets and poverty alleviation, I mean, some of the strategies that some of the development finance institutions have tried, I think some of them worked, some of them haven't. I think for some of the microfinance institutions who are moving from small-scale lending up to SME financing, again, probably some of it's worked, some of it hasn't. But again, I haven't seen, from a developed market pension fund perspective, There have been some experiments with renewable energy infrastructure in developing countries. Again, some worked, some didn't. But that's the kind of thing I'd like to explore. How can we get more of that? When it comes to early stage tech, obviously we've seen some fund of funds vehicles, but institutional investors typically don't like fund of funds, but then they want huge tickets. So how do you get a huge ticket without a fund of funds in venture capital, right? So we've got to find ways of getting over these obstacles.
I also think that if we think about, obviously we don't have the right solution in place, because otherwise the capital would be moving. That's not to say that some of the people doing fantastic things in impact investing and blended finance, that they aren't doing important projects. But if we think about what's the figure for the PRI now, about 120 trillion people signed up. So the latest figure for GIN on true impact investing is 1.2 trillion. So there's a big problem there in terms of, again, deployment of capital. So maybe there isn't the right solution yet. Maybe I'm hoping this research might come up with a good way. I mean, James is at UBS. I was at something during the week here that UBS does for some of their high net worth in individuals, talking about responsible investment and impact investing. Obviously, philanthropy, money, foundations, etc., can play a role, but I don't think everything should fall back there. I think that we should be able to do something better. We keep talking about the fact, if I hear one more time how much money there is out there looking for a home, well, there's plenty of homes for it to go to. So it's what's the mismatch? I talked about the fact that I chair Finance for Peace, and one of the things we're trying to do is look at some of these blockages as well, and how do you create the right pathway? How do you engage with the peace community in terms of peace enhancing mechanisms to take some of the risk away for investors? Again, I understand that an investor's role is to make money, but I do still think that there's things wrong with the financial system, why small amounts of money can't find its home there. I think this all comes back to the fact that from a governmental level, we measure the wrong things. We measure GDP, we measure what we make. We don't measure the impact that what we make has and the impact that it has on people on the planet. And then that stems all basically through the financial system. I can't do that because where's it going to fit in my strategic asset allocation? Because I've got to beat this benchmark, and if I don't meet that benchmark, well, why can't we create new benchmarks? Why can't we create different ways of thinking about asset allocation? We've been talking about these things for as long as I can remember. There must be solutions. I personally wish I had them. I don't, but I'm hoping, again, some great academics do it.
That's a great way to end it here and hand it over to David. And thank you very much to the panel.
Katherine, it's not clear whether 300 is the total pot or whether there are batches of 300 available. Can I clarify?
Not batches.
Total pot for now, but soon.
I'll see you after this.
So just want to say a few words, but I know that I'm between you and perhaps some refreshment, and we've had a fabulous conversation this afternoon. I was on the board of the PRI from 2009 to 2015, so I crossed over both James and Fiona, and I think you can see their intellect, their passion, their vision on display here today, and the fact that James, when the PRI was conceptualised, I think if you'd said that by 2024 that we'd have more than 5,000 signatories, 650 of them are in emerging markets, representing 120 US trillion in 100 countries around the globe, I think we would have said you were dreaming. Well, it's fantastic that you dreamt, because notwithstanding that we're not there yet, because we're not, We don't solve these existential issues that are facing humanity without some really bold, imaginative, informed thinking. But the fact that you began that journey with the investment community has got us to this point. And then Fiona has come in with her own sense of passion and idea of how you activate, frankly, potentially a very traditional and comfortable investment community, comfortable with themselves, comfortable with their lifestyles, and to create enough friction out there that says, no, actually, this is important for us to do. So now responsible investment is not seen as niche. It's seen as mainstream. Now, that comes with its own challenges. But I guess the point about this is that effectively what the responsible investment thesis is doing is challenging the way we make decisions around finance, how we think about value, how we think about existential issues. And we're now reimagining the way finance works. We're replumbing finance. Now, that happened because it was informed by research. It was informed by new ways of thinking. It was informed by bringing different communities together and seeding new thinking. And so this is where this research fits in. The board was wanting to find a way in which it could acknowledge the leadership of James and Fiona, and thought, what better way than to create a pool of money that would create some opportunities for some new thinking, for some fresh thinking, for some issues that we're having to deal with today. And as has been said, the West or the developed markets can be completely integrated and address all of these issues, these existential issues, these sustainability issues, and it will not move the dial. It will only move if we can get money moving from the north to the south. It can only move if we don't think about these issues in a compartmentalised way, that we actually integrate our thinking approach and that we recognise that the E, the S and the G all need to be put together. So I'm just thrilled that we've got this opportunity in a small way to make our contribution to inform new thinking and to create some opportunities where we can support the new ideas that are going to allow us to get finance playing the role it can play in addressing these macro issues. So now, with that, I do want to say some final thank yous to Katherine and to the research team for all the work that went into preparing for the grant, to all the jury members who've agreed to review the applications, and I think we have some really interesting proposals to consider, and we've already seen some sort of thinking about that today. To Barings and Sean for kindly hosting us today and giving us the opportunity to launch this grant in person, and to everyone who's contributed to the logistics of the event, and to all of you who've been here. This event was oversubscribed, shows you the interest. I think a few things, shows you the interest, shows also that people really wanted to get behind James and Fiona in their contributions. And finally, of course, I would like to thank both of them. We would not be here without their contributions. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, David, as well.